Let's start the edit by multiprocessing our base exposure image 6502. Right click on it, choose to create a virtual copy, and let's start processing for the sky. We'll bring up the color temperature to around 8,000 or so, bring up the tint to maybe around 5. Next, I want to lift the shadows in this image, not because I'm trying to process everything here, but I do want to have a closer match between my layers when I blend them. That'll make for a more successful blend. To get there, I need to keep the highlights where they are, but lift the shadows. One way we can do that is to bring down the highlights at the same time we bring up exposure. So let's bring down highlights, maybe around 40 points, and lift the exposure by 1 stop, just to even things out. There's a lot more subtle detail in the tree here. Not all the detail we want, but enough to kind of better match as we go to blend. We can also bring up the shadows a bit and lift those to maybe around 40 or so, I think is going to be a better match. So that's a good starting place for the image. Going down next, I'd like to add a little split toning to bring more color to the sky. Hold down Alt or Option and then go find the best hue. And I think somewhere around maybe 38 looks good. And then we can bring up the saturation to something like 35 points. Oftentimes when I warm up the highlights, I like to cool down the shadows because you wouldn't expect to see a bunch of warming on the backside of this tree. It should look a little cooler. So if we bring up the shadows to around that 220, 230 mark is usually the range, and just bring it up by a few points, maybe only 10 points I think is all we need. Next up, let's turn off the sharpening so we don't have any blending artifacts. We'll turn that on later. For noise reduction, I don't think we need much noise reduction, but in this case, we're blending for the sky, which may as well be a little smoother, and there could be some shadow noise. I'll bring it up to about 10. Zooming in for a moment, just look at the detail, and I think I'm fine with that level of noise reduction. Going down further, I do want to use profile corrections. I typically do that, although we don't need to add as much vignette corrections. Let's bring that down about halfway. And then lastly, under camera calibration, let's play with the red slider. Obviously, things get ridiculous if you go all the way up, but if we back it off to a more reasonable value, somewhere in the vicinity of 20, I think looks pretty good. And then let's bring up our blue primary and bring in that saturation. You can push that pretty far. So I'm going to go all the way to maybe about 80 or so there. And at this point, we've added more blue to the sky. So I think we can push the warmth even more. Take our white balance temperature and let's push that up more to about 9600 to warm up the sky a little bit more. And then I still like a little more pop in the sky. So if we bring up the contrast, see what we can't get out of it. Just bringing up a little bit, maybe around 20 points of contrast. And that I think is a very good sky. Let's right click to create a virtual copy of our virtual copy. This will give us a duplicate with the same starting point, which we can then process for the foreground details. So for this tree, we need to bring up the exposure maybe around 1.5, and then we can push our shadows up considerably. Let's go all the way to 100, which looks flat, but we can add more contrast down in the tone curve. Let's bring up our lights here to about 75, and notice how much the edge of the tree is starting to glow now with that move. And then we'll bring down the darks by about 25. And I think we can turn off this contrast adjustment we did earlier, which is starting to push too much purple color here. I don't like the purple color. We're gonna have to probably deal with that later in post, but I think the color in general is pretty good. Coming down, the split toning looks fine, so let's leave that on. Under the detail tab, we should leave sharpening off. Noise reduction, though, is a critical question. As we zoom in to the details here, there's certainly a lot of noise in this image, so we can push up the noise reduction considerably. Let's right click and create a virtual copy. And on this one, let's bring up the noise reduction to about 40 points or so. And see how that does a nice job of removing that noise. Now if we command click on the previous iteration, hit C to compare, we have two images side by side which are identical other than the amount of luminance noise reduction, so we can see exactly what's getting better and what may be getting a little bit worse. Clearly at 40 points of noise reduction, the background areas just really addresses a lot of that noise, that awful looking grain there. So I think that's a significant improvement. But then looking at some other areas such as the detail in this bush and the wall here, the image on the right has a little more detail. So ideally, we might use some blend of these two to get maximum detail. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll use all three of these images. So command click on our sky version, we'll right click and we'll choose to edit in, open as layers in Photoshop.